Hello, in this lesson I will be discussing sociological research methods. Before we talk about the methods that sociologists use to conduct research, I want to provide a quick definition of sociology. There's a definition that appears in the textbook and lots that you can find online, but the definition that I have on the screen here, I think captures both the breadth and the depth of what sociology has to offer. So, sociology is the empirical or scientific study of human society and social interactions. This definition is short, but it packs a punch. There's a few components that I want to hone in on. So, the first part is this word empirical. Empirical means based on experimentation or observation, not just theory. And we'll talk about what a scientific theory is in a separate lesson. But I don't want to downplay what a theory is. But empirical means that it's a scientific field of study. Other empirical fields of study include biology and economics, just as an example. So it's a scientific field of study, and its main subjects are human society and social interaction. Now, even those two terms are pretty broad. Human society involves a lot of different things, and social interaction as a concept involves a lot of different things. But you can get a sense from this definition that sociology is a scientific field of study, and that its main concepts or its main focus is on society and the interactions that happen within a society. Now, to say that sociology is a science means that sociologists are more interested in patterns than we are in randomness. We observe, analyze, and try to understand things like averages. For example, the average age of marriage, the average home value in a city. Excuse me. We also try to understand trends, like popular baby names and how the way we name our children changes over time. We also study things that are called phenomena, things that recur or are predictable. Outliers, or things that go against the trend, that go against patterns, outliers and anomalies are important. They're interesting and they're an important part of our human experience. But the focus for the field of sociology is on patterns. Sociologists are in business because social life, interactions, and the development of societies, for example, shows a significant degree of structure, patterning, and predictable sequences and processes. In other words, our social world is not random. The small details of human life, things that we might take for granted or think are unique or random, are often built within larger features of a society. In this lesson, I want to talk about how the connections between the ways, or the overlaps between the ways that a sociologist might approach a research study and the ways scientists in general approach research. On the screen here, I have what I'm calling is an illustration that I created that show the steps in the research process. Now, these steps are general. If you were a chemist or an engineer or a psychologist and you were conducting a research study, you would probably follow some steps like these. So I want to kind of talk in general about steps in the research process in the sciences, and also talk about specifics as they pertain to sociology. So again, sociology is not just an opinion-based field. It's not a philosophy necessarily. It's a social science, which means the facts that sociologists present are evidence-based claims. And the steps in this research process that almost act like a staircase explain how we make those evidence-based claims. So the basic building blocks of any scientific research study are on the slide here. The first steps involve deciding what you need to ask. Then you have to figure out what are the best tools and methods to use to answer that question. And then you go out and collect and analyze and eventually report your results. So I'm going to kind of take you through briefly each of the steps in this research process. Beginning with this first question, or the first part of the staircase, what to ask. So when scientists approach a research study, you can study almost anything in a scientific fashion. But in general, when established scientific fields approach a research question or a new research project, when they're trying to figure out what questions to ask, they consider three things: values, theoretical traditions, and code of ethics. And this is especially true, this last point of code of ethics is especially true in the social sciences or any fields dealing with human research. So the first point, values. Even though science has a reputation for being unbiased and objective, the truth is humans are scientists. And so every decision on what you want to study is rooted in some value system. Whether, for example, there's a lot of research on environmentalism right now. The scientists who are studying environmental change are approaching each study that they conduct in an objective fashion. But their decision to study climate change, let's say, is rooted in a value system. It could also, a decision to pursue a study might be rooted in a value to profit, right? There's certain areas of research that are more profitable than others. But the value set of the scientist is part of what weighs in on what someone asks. But that's not the only thing. There are also theoretical traditions in every field that you have to consider. So theoretical traditions we'll talk more about in next week's lesson, and we'll spend a couple weeks talking about some of the main theoretical traditions in sociology. But these are basically frameworks that are used to make sense of the world and to articulate a lot of patterns that seem disconnected, but can be explained and tested in the language of a theory. So there's certain theories that are more established than others. And so new scientists, right, as they are degreed and come into the field, rarely pursue a line of inquiry that's brand new to themselves. They sometimes, often, I should say, piggyback on a theoretical tradition. In other words, they follow a line of inquiry that other scientists are also pursuing, right, to be in conversation with other scientists. And then the final thing that a researcher has to consider is the code of ethics. And this is true when you're studying human subjects, especially. The code of ethics in the social sciences are a set of guidelines that outline what's considered moral and acceptable behavior on the part of the scientist, how you conduct yourself and how you conduct your study, and also what's acceptable for participants to endure, let's say, in the name of science. So we'll talk about theoretical traditions more next week, and we'll talk about some of the substantive areas of sociology. But on the slide here, I have just some examples of some of the areas of study that sociologists pursue, including crime and deviance, and race, ethnicity, education, etc. So the next step in figuring out what to ask, after you check in with your value set, theoretical traditions, and code of ethics in your field, the next step is defining the problem. In any research study, one of the first things you have to do is identify and define what your main concepts are. And a concept is an abstract definition of what's going to be studied. So I'm an urban sociologist. I study cities, neighborhoods, and communities, and the people and interactions within them. So for me, a concept of interest might be something, again, abstract and kind of broad: life in the city. Life in the city, broadly conceived, could mean a lot of different things. So in addition to identifying your concept, the next thing you want to do is to identify your units of analysis, which are the people, places, and things that you intend to study, the things that represent that concept. In a research study, your concept is refined into a variable. And most of you have heard the word variable in a lot of different classes before, mathematics and science classes mainly. In this context, a variable is a measure or indicator of a concept. When we come up with a way to measure a concept, so life in the city is abstract. We need a way to measure it. The process of turning a concept into a variable is called operationalizing, or operationalization. In any research study, it's an examination of the relationship between variables. In order to understand variables a little bit better, we'll move on to the next step in that staircase and discuss hypotheses. So sometimes a hypothesis is just called an educated guess, but in a literal sense, in the context of a research study, a hypothesis is a proposed relationship between two or more variables. A hypothesis can also be thought of as a tentative prediction we have about what we might discover before we begin the research study. For example, I want to study life in the city. And some variables that I might be interested in is how long people live in a city, so their duration or their tenure in a city, as it's sometimes called. And maybe I have this interest in loneliness or social connection. So two variables I'm interested in, residents in a city, are three variables. Whether or not someone lives in a city, how long they've lived in a city, and some question about social connection or lack of connection. And so a hypothesis that I might propose might be like the one on the slide here. As an example, I might say something like, people living in cities become lonelier over time. Hypotheses also always include an independent variable and a dependent variable. As the image on the slide suggests, the independent variable is the characteristic that will determine or have an effect on the dependent variable. The dependent variable is always the outcome. So in my example, people living in cities become lonely over time. The dependent variable is loneliness. That's the outcome we think might change. And how long you live in the city would be the independent variable. So once you have your concepts, you even have a research question, or you have your hypothesis, the next step is figuring out how you answer that question. And the type of question you have, the type of hypothesis that you propose, will steer you to a certain type of research design. In sociology, there's a lot of different research designs. Some of the ones that were discussed in the chapter include audit studies and surveys and questionnaires and interview studies, ethnographies. I'm going to discuss the research designs in sociology in two categories: quantitative research and qualitative research. Quantitative research is a term that captures a wide spectrum of different types of methodologies, but they all come down to research studies that try to analyze information about the social world that is already in numeric form or that can be converted into numeric form. So whenever you see a statistical analysis that has to do with people, that's a quantitative study. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of population research on population change in terms of like income. So for instance, reports on median home income and how it's changed in a certain city over time is an example of a quantitative style reporting. The data speaks to humans and our experience with work, with money, with the class system, but the way that the data is reported is in a quantitative fashion. Here's another example of quantitative reporting. So this graphic here shows the growth in the U.S. urban population between the end of the 1700s and 2015. We'll talk about this graphic more as it relates to some important concepts in our class, but you can ascertain a lot of information from something like this. This is census data, so it's the entire U.S. population over several decades, and it's asking a question: do people that took this census, did they live in a rural area or did they live in an urban area? And just by plotting that data, you can see this immense trend that America shifted from a majority rural and agrarian or farm-based society and economy to a majority industrial urban one over the course of several decades. So we'll talk about quantitative data like this. This one specifically, this graph and the story it tells a little bit in the next couple weeks. But the good things that quantitative research do, the things that quantitative research is useful for is telling stories about a large swath of the population. In other words, quantitative research is often generalizable. What you get from a breadth of information, you get a lot of information about you get a little information about a lot of people. So in this case, we know something about a lot of Americans, hundreds of millions of people over the course of a couple hundred years, just by looking at this one plot of data. What quantitative data is good in that it is broad, or it has breadth, but what it has in breadth, it lacks in depth or nuance. I don't know, by looking at this graph, for example, why someone was motivated to move from a rural area in 1870, and was that motivation to move to an urban area the same as someone in 1920, right? Did everyone in 1860, did all 30% or whatever this graph is representing, did the 70% of the people who didn't move to urban areas, right, did they experience this shift, right? There's a lot of questions we might be able to ask about this data that's not represented just in this quantitative reporting. Another branch of sociological research designs fall under the umbrella term qualitative research. Qualitative research attempts to analyze information about the social world that cannot be readily converted to numeric form. One example of a qualitative research design that's talked about in chapter 2 is ethnography. So ethnography involves oftentimes both interviewing and observations of social life or subcultures, groups in their natural surroundings, quote unquote. An ethnographer's job is to live amongst people and understand their experience from almost like a fly on the wall, or as one ethnographer said, like you're their family dog. It's a type of research that involves a lot of immersive work, and an immense amount of time spent to collect this data. And so you don't learn from ethnography about every American. You can't make claims about hundreds of millions of people, but the stories that you get from living with someone, for example, I had a professor in college who wrote a book on homelessness. He's an expert on homelessness. He has several books on it. But one of the studies he did was an ethnography, living as a homeless man, spending time in a shelter for several weeks. So the level of reporting, the depth of reporting you get from this kind of method is its strength. What it lacks in breadth or generalizability, it gains in breadth. Okay, so there's lots more that we could talk about as it pertains to research methods, but let me end this lesson by giving you an example of a way I might pose an exam question related to Chapter 2 and the material in Chapter 2. So I know that by the time this class is over, most of you will not immediately go on to conduct a sociological research study. However, understanding the main tenets of research methods, research design, things like that, I think is an important exercise, especially if you're in one of the science majors. But even if you're not in one of the scientific fields of study as your major, it's still important to understand how science is produced, so to speak. So here's an example an exam question that I might ask you. It asks you to speak to something about, to sort of, it's a thought exercise, a thought experiment, so to speak. Like, if you conducted a research study, what are some ways to do it qualitatively? What are some ways to do it quantitatively? What are the potential benefits? Right? So a question about strengths and weaknesses. And so some of what I just said in this lesson were the strengths and weaknesses, the difference between breadth and depth. Now you'll need to go and read chapter 2 to get a more nuanced understanding of what I mean by that. But this is a type of question that you can practice with, responding to, and you might see it on our very first exam.